learned. And it's the same thing here. One has to be very sober, analyzing the lessons learned. And I learned a lot from the past year. I made errors, significant errors in some cases, born of illusions. So, trying to figure out the lessons learned. It's been, on the political front, there's been an absence of activity. And on the battlefield, it's very hard to assess. Gaza, as was indicated yesterday, many outlets, media outlets, humanitarian organizations. There was the 1 year commemoration of what happened in Gaza. And I think the reasonable conclusion is that Gaza is no more. There's nothing left in Gaza. Right now, if you recall, at the very, very beginning, when Israel first gave the order, I'm talking about October, roughly around October 10th, 2023, when Israel gave the order for the people in the north to go south, and they drew the line. You remember? They drew the line. I said at the time, well, it's obvious what Israel's going to do. It's going to declare the northern sector a buffer zone and effectively annex the northern part of Gaza. Now, it took a year, but that's actually what they're doing right now. The claim is, which I consider complete nonsense, we're going to clear out Hamas and then we'll let the people back. No, they're not letting the people back. That's not going to happen. First of all, there's not going to be anything left to come back to. They will flatten the whole northern sector of Gaza. That's what they're saying, There's no secret about that. And Lebanon, it looks pretty grim. I think there's no denying that Hezbollah was dealt a very big blow. What will happen? I don't know. I've been listening to all these military analyses and whether Israel knocked out all of Hezbollah's long-range missiles, whether Israel can isolate the south of Lebanon from the Litani down and just bomb it relentlessly like it did Gaza, and everybody will be wiped out. I'm not a military person, so I don't know. I know that the party of God will fight to the last person, but it's not even clear whether that will be an option, because Syed Nasrallah's stature enabled him to carve out some political space vis-a-vis Iran. In other words, he doesn't just do what Iran says. He had was able to assert an independence and autonomy. And now that's not going to be an option, assuming the person that replaced him is in his 20s or 30s, which is what Nasrallah was when he replaced his predecessor, when his predecessor was assassinated by Israel. If it's a young man, he can't stand up to the Iranian regime. And the Iranian regime, it's going to be looking out for its own interests. And it may say, we're going to end all the resistance in exchange for a ceasefire. And then the Hezbollah won't have an option except to agree. So they've lost a lot of their autonomy, I believe. So all in all, it looks grim. What can I tell you? It's the only thing one can do. I had a very close friend, the West Bank, and when the first intifada was defeated, I asked him, did anything good come of this? Meaning the civil revolt. Did anything positive come of it? And he said, because he was a real political person, he said, the lessons learned. He said, lessons learned. And it's the same thing here. One has to be very sober, analyzing the lessons learned. And I learned a lot from the past year. I made errors, significant errors in some cases, born of illusions. So trying to figure out the lessons learned.
I'm curious your analysis of...
And as Nasrallah said in his last speech, he said Israel has the technological edge. And they're smart enough to know that, around October 7th. So that was just another way of saying we're not ready for the great confrontation. And so he tried to carve out a middle path, namely lobbing rockets and missiles at northern Israel, not really causing all that much damage, apart from the population had to evacuate. About estimates are 50 to 60,000 people had to evacuate, but not a full-scale confrontation. And if you look back then, by far, by an immeasurable distance, the worst blows were being suffered in South Lebanon. Hundreds of people were killed in South Lebanon, including hundreds of Hezbollah fighters. And about, 200,000 or 100 to 200,000 Lebanese had to evacuate. Today, the Times showed the pictures of South Lebanon, and it looks like the moonscape. It looks like Gaza. Actually, it looks worse. So he didn't have options. He tried to carve out a path, but I said at the time, if you remember, I said at the time that when people are asking, what do you think is going to happen the day after? What do you think is going to happen the day after? I said, I think we're closer to the beginning than to the end, because I don't believe that Israel will give Hezbollah a pass. They're going to do something. Now, that was only partially correct, because it didn't until the assassinations and then the walkie-talkie and pager undertaking, it didn't occur to me that they were going to use this occasion to wipe out Hezbollah.
You've said that you were wrong about Hezbollah, and I want to know if you could elaborate on what you mean by that.
Well, I'll begin with an anecdote, a germane anecdote. I remember discussing Hezbollah with Professor Chomsky, and he said, I don't believe it's a significant military threat to Israel. And I take seriously anything he says, but I was skeptical of that judgment, especially because they did get at minimum a draw in 2006. So it seemed like they had established their own deterrence capability against Israel. So I didn't agree with that judgment. What I didn't see, because I didn't know, was after 2006, Israel invested a large amount of resources to the showdown, to the final showdown. Hezbollah had that unique characteristic of being very ideological, but also it tapped into the mental resources of the Arab Muslim world. They are fundamentally the fact that every Arab Muslim is going to be a civil engineer, an electrical engineer. I know Arabs and Muslims very well. They're part of my life at this point. Everyone's going to be a civil engineer, an electrical engineer, or go into something like IT, okay? So you had this wedding, this melding of ideological conviction and technical know-how. And I believed that the ideological conviction was such that they could prevail, or at least equal Israel. What I didn't see, and I frankly have to admit it, and here's going to be a digression, and you'll forgive me, and you can stop me. So my best friend growing up was Mark Cohn. And Mark Cohn was a surpassingly brilliant fellow, for sure. And he eventually became the CTO, Chief Technology Officer, for Unisys, which is one of the large computer firms in Washington and very connected to the Defense Department. And he liked mental games. When we were all out on our bicycles, he was in his room playing chess. He liked mental games. So Mark eventually became the head of the computer system in the Bush-Cheney White House. And he once said to me, he was trying to, I guess, justify what he was doing. He said, Norman, they work very hard, meaning Bush, not Bush, but Cheney, Rumsfeld, and so forth. And in fact, it was true. They work very hard. If you read the stories about Rumsfeld stood at a lectern. He never sat at his desk. He stood at a lectern, and he used to write all these memos, and they called them Rumsfeld's snowflakes. He was always giving the memos, And I didn't get that the other side has his ideological convictions, which are as fervent as Hezbollah's, except they had 1,000 times the resources, because it's the Pentagon, it's British intelligence, it's German intelligence, it's French intelligence, it's the whole quote-unquote Western world, which is invested in bringing down Hezbollah.